Hello, everyone. This is Hano with Eidenhouse Consulting. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on identity management. Which comes first, governance or automation? I'm joined today by Brian Chris from Hitachi ID.
Hi there, Hannah. Thanks for having us. I'm delighted to be here and joining the conversation.
Excellent. Well, without further ado, actually, I thought I would start off with a quick poll and see where people are. Do you think automation should come first or governance first? It should be popping up on your screen now. I'd like to see what the audience thinks before we get started. We'll give it a little bit of time here. Getting close. Keep voting. Almost there. All right. Well, that's actually a first. It's a 50-50 tie. It's
Wow.
literally 50% automation, 50% governance. So this should be an interesting conversation. I'm gonna enjoy this. So let's go ahead and dig right in. We always like to start off with making sure that we're all on the same page with regards to some basic terms and a basic understanding of identity and access management. We're gonna go through a few slides here just to set some context and then dig into the meat of the issue. So let's begin with some definitions. What's an identity, an entitlement? What does authorization mean? So we can think of an analogy in the real world where, let's say you go to a bank, right, and they want to know whether you're a customer or not. So in order to establish your identity, they collect some information from you. They validate your national identifier, whether it's a social security number or whatever, and then you open an account. Is it a personal account, savings account, checking account, commercial accounts? And then within that, you basically have rules, what you can and cannot access based on your identity and what accounts you've opened. And then there are also authorizations, so limits to things that you can do. So let's say I'm trying to withdraw money from the ATM, and at least the banks that I bank with, it's capped at $500 a day. I can't take out more than $500. My line of credit may be capped at a certain amount. I'm only allowed to do deposit checks in a certain amount, right? So there's authorizations that determine what I can and cannot do within my relationship within those accounts. So hopefully that sets a nice baseline. I don't know, Brian, if there's anything you want to add here.
No, that's a great illustration. I think we all get that. Everybody has a bank account. We understand that our identity with the bank governs what we can and can't do.
All right, so moving along, second part of definitions, we also are going to talk a bit about things like business events, access management, and automated access management. So what is the difference between those? We think of a business event, if you're hiring someone, that is a business event, right? It could be that we have an event where they accept the offer and we create the user account. Then we have another event, which is their first day of work, where we activate the account. Those business events indicate to us that there's been some change in the user's relationship to the organization, whether they have a new role, they're joining us, they're leaving us, and then allows us to take action on that specific event. Access management is the process of adjusting user access based on those changes to identity. What access should the person have? If the person has a new role, what access should we remove? What access needs to be added? And then if we look at automated access management, this is where we have a tight integration with the authoritative source. So for employees, that tends to be the HR system, and we're regularly getting updates from that system, whether it's real time or a batch process that runs every few hours. And so then the system is able to automatically take action on those changes and update the user's account downstream. So pulling it all together, we really have the building blocks here of an identity management solution, right? So identity management is oriented around managing the user life cycle. Begins with the onboarding process to create that identity. We have updates as the person moves through their career, and then when the person leaves the organization, we remove access. What the person can and cannot do in our systems is governed by policies, and those policies can be administered by the identity management solution itself. And that identity data and access data can also be pushed downstream to the endpoints, the consuming applications and systems that rely on that identity data to manage the user's local accounts in those systems. So I think we've done a nice job here of talking about the building block concepts, how they come together to form a system that manages the user lifecycle and hopefully sets a good basis for the rest of our conversation. Brian, any thoughts before I move on?
No, I think you've covered it quite well. Let's get into the meat of it.
Great. So what is the problem with identity and access management? Well, the problem is that it all sounds nice in theory, but there's a lot of complexity in our environments, right? So organizations start out with manual processes. When you're a small business, it's completely manageable to manually create and remove access for users. As the organization grows to a medium-sized business, we add some more people to help administer a larger user population, and then eventually we get to the point where we've hit the manageability threshold, right? There's only so much we can do. There's really diseconomies of scale. We have so many users coming into and out of the organization, and so many changes that it's very difficult for administrators to keep up with the workload. So there's a lot of manual effort. It tends to be inconsistent. The provisioning processes start breaking down. When someone new comes in the organization, they often don't get all the access they need, and they have to submit multiple requests in order to get productive. And admins are prone to taking shortcuts. As their workload goes up, it's a lot easier to say, well, I'm going to make Bob like Sue because they're in similar roles, and it's much easier for them to provision the access, but really they may have over-provisioned Bob by making his account look exactly like Sue's. Additionally, we're also not removing access as people move through their careers, and we get entitlement creep, where rights keep getting added but are never taken away. Another
I just add one other thing in here, Hanno. While somebody in IT could make some of these changes, so let's say they can sort through all of the complexity. One of the real challenges there is, when these requests and things get to the IT department or whoever's in charge, just because they can pull the lever or turn the knob doesn't mean they have the wherewithal to do that, right? Or are they making a good decision? And so that complexity is compounded by oftentimes the lack of knowledge with the person who's in control.
Thanks, Brian. And one final point I want to make before we move on is that, the other piece here is around terminations. If we're manually creating people in our endpoints, we don't know who's in our applications and systems. So what do? We send a spreadsheet around when someone leaves the organization saying, hey, please remove this user if they're in your application. We're not sure. Well, is your security program predicated now on a scavenger hunt to try and find these users and where they may exist, possibly, so that we can finally remove them and close that security hole? It's really not a good strategy. At the same time, too, the application environment is also expanding, right? We're getting more and more applications. With the advent of cloud, it's so much easier to stand up a server, stand up an application. Power Apps in Azure offers a new capability to give business users, plug and play features to create workflows and build their own business apps, which is wonderful. But what are the controls in place to manage that access and make sure that we're not creating a security problem at the same time? So,
Hanno, if I could just chime in.
Yeah.
Hanno, I'm sorry. If I could just chime in on that last slide there, I think there's another problem that really needs to be driven home here, which is you hit the nail on the head. The number of applications keep growing, and if you think about these applications in terms of ownership, right, it's not uncommon for a user to have 5-6 kinds of applications to do their job, and typically these applications have different owners, right? Different teams are responsible for these applications. So if you think about the time that could be spent onboarding and getting the user all of the things they need, that can be multiplied by the number of application owners sometimes. So it is truly a problem.
Thanks, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
So pulling it all together, if we look at this from end to end, we have complex privileges to manage. We have multiple teams that have to be coordinated. We have a decentralized environment where administrators have a lot of latitude to make decisions about what they think the security policies mean. We eventually hit a threshold where we're really not managing our identities very effectively, right? We have inconsistent processes. Administrators are doing their best. They may take shortcuts when they're busy. They have their own interpretation of how to apply security policies. We tend to see a lot of errors in the work that's done, which results in rework. They don't provision access fully. They don't quite get people into the accounts properly, or users have to make multiple requests to get what they need So the users have a bad experience. It impacts their productivity. It impacts their ability to work. And our costs are really skyrocketing because we have to throw more people at the problem, and it just quite honestly doesn't scale. We get to a diseconomies of scale, a manageability threshold, and we're just not able to manage identities in an effective way. So we deny ourselves the opportunity in this situation to put security first because we're spending so much time on routine administrative tasks, security almost becomes an afterthought. So the goal here ultimately is to simplify this environment, think about simplifying where we can and automating where we can to take some of this administrative burden off of our teams. So interestingly, we've talked about some of these problems with managing the user lifecycle, getting them into and out of systems. While organizations struggle with managing user access, they most often start their programs with a focus on access governance. So access governance is one of the key drivers for organizations because compliance is so difficult. There's a big focus on certification, recertification of access. It tends to be a painful, tedious manual process. Auditors are beating up the organization. Business owners don't really know what to do. There's no central way to manage recertifications. It requires a lot of forensics, digging in and trying to figure out who has access to what, and then should they have access, right? So identity management in regards to governance has the opportunity of standing up some collectors that allow us to aggregate data from non-connected systems. It's the opportunity quite often that is staring the business in the face and the one that causes them the most pain. And because of that, the program tends to focus on the single pain point of improving governance without considering the broader portfolio of pain points, a lot of which we've just discussed, that could also be addressed with an identity management solution. So this is kind of a whack-a-mole strategy where whatever pops up and is painful, we're going to address that, and we're going to focus our thinking and efforts on that. And we're really making tactical decisions where the squeaky wheel is getting the grease, and we're not thinking about the overall strategy and the overall capabilities of the tool and how we could use it to solve broader problems in the organization. Brian, something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I will. I think if you look at the bigger picture here, right? Even with a mature certification system in place, you see the graphic of the guy here shaking the pig to what's in the bank, after all of this, and the idea here, I think, really needs to be driven home is that certification's great. It's a part of identity and access management, but it's a snapshot in time. Even if you have a really mature system, you can connect to a few things. You maybe can automate a few pieces. That certification's good for a day. A week later, a month later, it's all irrelevant, right? And so then you look at it and say, well, what did I buy? I really just bought a snapshot in time. And so that's sort of the punchline here, is that certification is not a forward-looking process, and so that's really the idea here.
Thanks, Brian. It actually reminds me of a recent customer example where we were integrating with their telecommunications solution, and they had relied on really manual processes and never put in place any checks and balances to figure out who had access to what. And so in the process of this integration, we found out that literally tens of thousands of accounts had never been removed. And while they couldn't access through the web browser, they could access through phone calls, and people were actually still using this customer's teleconference lines, and they were incurring costs because of that. By integrating the system, we were actually able to not only reveal these accounts that should have been terminated, we were actually able to terminate them all and close that security hole very quickly. So it drove not only awareness, but it also drove our ability to act on that information and remediate the issue. So one of the interesting statistics about identity and access management is that 4 out of 5 executives, even when they get their identity management system stood up, are unhappy with the value that they've received, right? Our goal is to get you on the right side of the percentages here, right? Because if we take a narrow view of what identity and access management is and what it can do for the organization, if we're only focused on one or two problems, then we've left so much value on the table. The reality is that identity management can touch everyone and everything in the organization. It provides a single place to manage the user lifecycle, define and enforce policies, support our auditing and reporting needs, hello governance, as well as cleaning up access to the connected systems, right? So if someone's left the organization, we can remove them from any system that's connected to our identity store. So this adds a lot more value to the business than just implementing a governance solution that is a detective control that shows us who has access to what and then allows us to go in and manually change that. This allows us to go in and take action on what we learn about our environment. So, really the warning lights are flashing in the business, right? There are common challenges that we've outlined in terms of provisioning the user lifecycle, and those result in very real impacts. We have lost productivity because we have a huge amount of users that don't have the access they need. They don't have the access they need. They can't get work done for the company. They can't request new access easily, which means they have to very long wait times before they get provisioned into a new system. Oftentimes they're not provisioned correctly. That results in rework and ultimately drives an increase in vulnerabilities. So people have access privileges. We're never taking access away. We're only granting access. And we have orphan accounts and systems because we're not sure what accounts the user was created in, and we don't have a really good way to remove that access when a person leaves. This all leads to an unacceptable regulatory standing where we can't prove that this person should be in this system. It results in audit findings and causes a lot of pain and consternation for the business.
I'd like to just chime in here for a minute. So I think when folks are considering automation and the risks, a lot of times what we do is we focus on audit risks, right? And I think that for the vast majority of adopters of these systems, that's what they're really trying to do. But if you can kind of think of it in terms of like the bad news lottery, you got to remember that eventually someone, it seems like about once a year, wins. In other words, what I mean is there's an actual compromise, and then they become, the headline story, for a season. And so, again, we focus on the regulatory risks and failing those audits, but the reality is there's a very possible risk that you're that bad guy that's name is plastered all over the news. So important to keep that in mind.
Don't be that guy. Is that what you're saying, Brian?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Don't be that guy.
All right. Don't be that guy. So why is identity and access automation so difficult? I would say it's because we have a combination of process, data, and technology that all have to come together in a new way and a new operating model in order for identity management to be effective. That begins with authoritative data, the ability to establish an identity. We have to have good data on the user, not only to know who they are, but also to implement any rules and actions the system might take to adjust their access. For employees, we have an HR system, and that's tied to people's pay. And if people's pay is at risk, you know that they're going to squawk if there's a problem. So you can follow the money on this one. The data tends to be excellent in HR systems. For contingent workers, though, they may not be in the HR system. Some organizations have legal concerns. They won't put contractors in their HR system, so they manage them in a database or a spreadsheet or some other tool. That also leads to questions about how are you managing your vendors? How are you establishing their identity and giving them access to what they need in the system? Excuse me. This leads to a proliferation of systems of record, right? We tend to have more than one system of record. We have the HR system for employees. We have a database or a ticketing system or some other system that's providing us identities for contingent workers. And then we have another one for vendors, say. Well, each of those has its own set of processes. They collect their own data set on the users, and they may or may not be well maintained. So HR tends to be very well maintained. Contractor databases, not so much. And I would submit vendor databases even less. Brian, any thoughts on that?
No, I think you did well there. Just a couple of years ago, I was a fractional CIO, right? And that vendor access, that was a big one, right? Leaving that door open. They came in for some legitimate work. They did what they needed to do, but those doors were never closed, and so that's a real problem. It really is.
So one final point I'd like to make on the slide before we move on is that, the data that's important to HR is not necessarily the same data that's important to identity management. So HR has its own reporting and legal requirements that it's trying to meet, payroll. Those items tend to be important. It's not always thinking about what do we need to manage this identity and manage it correctly downstream, because they never had to think about that. So it's important to look at your data attributes and determine what's important from an identity management perspective and communicate that with HR. And they may need to change their SLA and processes to get you better data. So that's certainly something to keep in mind. So that's part of the challenge of establishing identity management, is making sure that those data sources are available and that the data is good. Which gets us into the processes that are driven off that data and driven off of those integrations. So we have people who are joining the organization. Sometimes they're brand new people. Hello, my first day of work, never been here before. And then we have rehires, and rehires are a bit of a special case. So there's all sorts of policies about, are we going to give them their old email address back? Are we going to give them the same access back that they had when they left before they came back? Are we going to deprovision everything and reprovision whatever is new? There's all sorts of decisions to be made about how to manage the rehire scenario. At the same time, we're also trying to establish that identity. We need a unique identifier, something that's unique and persistent that we can use across systems. Now, what we often do is, for employees, we use the employee ID out of the HR system. And if we're minting user IDs in the identity management system, we'll exchange those unique keys between the two systems. And this maintains bidirectional integrity for the user's identity. And small to mid-sized organizations, that's less important. But when you have a large organization and you have acquisitions and divestitures and a lot of change, having that bidirectional integrity actually can make a huge difference in avoiding mistakes and making sure that you're really updating the correct identity.
Just chime in here for a minute, Hanno, if you will. So, one of the things that I think is important to call attention to on this slide is that we're looking at, a good identity and access management solution and its automation must accommodate joiners, movers, leavers. But if you think back to that definition slide, we can't also ignore the business events. And a lot of times these business events are personal life events too. So take, for example, how does the system accommodate this? You fire or terminate somebody. During some period of time thereafter, as is customary in a lot of cultures, they get married, they change their name, and they think, oh, well, you know what? I'm just gonna now that I've got a different name, I'm gonna apply back at this company that fired me. And so can what you have in place accommodate that? Can it detect that, hey, this is really just the same person trying to sneak back into the organization under a different name? So it's not as straightforward as you would think. The joiner, mover, leaver processes have to be able to accommodate all these life and business events along the way.
I think those are some excellent points, Brian. One of the other special use cases that we see too is conversions. So if we have a contractor who's converting to an employee or vice versa, how do we manage that? Are we going to break the user's access? If the user is going to become they're a contractor today, they're going to be an employee tomorrow. We want them to continue in the same work. We're just bringing them inside the organization. How do we manage that conversion so they don't lose access, so we don't break the user? If the contractor and employee identities are both managed in the HR system, that becomes an easier task, but often that's not the case. So you've got to think about those edge cases as well and how are you going to manage them.
That's an excellent point, because that happens in higher education too, where you have students who go into an alumni database or become faculty. So excellent point.
All right, Brian, this one's yours.
All right. Okay. So yeah, glad to chime in here. So one of the early slides we talked about was complexity, and we talked about not really knowing where to go to get the access you need. That's one, and then who to ask or what to fill out. And so one of the things that I just want to share here is that when I started at Compaq, a billion years ago, I literally sat in my office and twiddled my thumbs for a week. Why? Because I was waiting on an AD account, and again, I'm going to date myself here, but I was waiting on a Banyan Vines email account, right? And so even though my boss kind of had an idea of what I needed and he sort of knew who to talk to, but there were just so many departments. And so what that ultimately leads to is confusion on behalf on all of the parties that really need to get this stuff. And so um, what we think is a better approach is to provide a uniform place for employees, managers, and ultimately approvers to go to deal with that, because otherwise you've just got just a set of disjointed processes that's confusing to everyone. And then the other thing that is really important aspect of good automation is access control. I hear folks say all the time, well, we've got a ticket system, we can use that to onboard, and to some extent that's true, but most of these ticket systems, they don't have really good access controls. And there's a lot going on in the slide here, but I'm sort of get to the punchline. And can you imagine if you're using a ticket system, and this does happen, Bob comes in one day, looks into the ticket system, and sees a ticket that says he's going to be terminated on Friday. That's bad, and it happens. And when you talk about a system that is managing identities, it really needs to understand relationships. It needs to understand the employer relationship. It needs to understand the peer relationship. It needs to be able to understand differences between departments so that you can avoid those kinds of really embarrassing and sensitive, possibly litigious situations. So anything you want to add here, Hanno? That was sort of my illustration on that, but if you got anything to add, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, that's a good point. I think one of the interesting things too that organizations sometimes fail to consider when standing up identity and access management is how do you handle future dated transactions, which can wind up processing things out of order and at the wrong time if you don't do it in a thoughtful way. So you have scheduled termination date, but if the system processes it on the date that it was entered into the system and not the date it actually becomes effective, that can create challenges for you too. So building the proper rules and the proper capabilities in terms of managing transactions from HR appropriately will save you a lot of heartache.
Yeah, great point. Thank you.
So moving on, intelligent automation. So we've really been building up to the benefits of automation in identity and access management solutions. Avoiding requests if possible is a nice mantra. We talked about the manageability threshold and having so many users that you're throwing more and more people at the problem in order to manage user access. But once we have an integrated identity management solution that connects our systems of record with an identity management hub and to our downstream application, we can actually start to simplify access management for the organization. It also gives us visibility into what all users have, right? So what's common across all users? Well, that really becomes birthright access, right? If everyone gets a network account and an email, we can automatically give that to everyone the moment we create their identity. No one ever has to touch it. No one has to request it. No one has to approve it. The system automatically fulfills it. So where the user access is predictable, we can start building rules to automatically assign access. Likewise, if we have unusual access or temporary access that needs to be provisioned, we can provide a request UI or portal, a place for the user to go to request access, put it through an approval process, whether it's the person's manager or the business owner or the application owner who has to approve. It may be multiple approvers. And once that request is approved, then the system can automatically fulfill. So the system now has taken a lot of the fulfillment work out of the environment. The organization now has a tool that will automatically fulfill access based on the user's relationship with the organization, whether it's birthright access or we know they're an accountant one and all accountant ones have access to these 3 applications. So as soon as you're hired into the accountant one role, we're going to give you those 3 applications. Now, if that accountant one needs additional access, they can go to the request portal and submit that request. If it's approved, then the system can reach out to that application and grant the accountant one access to that application. The visibility we also get peer-to-peer also lets us look at, what access do accountants one generally have, and let us see what the patterns are in the organization in a way that we just can't without an integrated system.
And I'll just chime in here and state for the record here that the birthright access is really the power. It's the immediate return that you get on a good automation system, because and you alluded to this, and then I'm thinking back to that slide that we saw earlier, which is the guy that gets 6 accounts on, to do his job. If you can imagine, he gets 3, 4, even 5 of those on day one, he's way better off than the old way of doing things, where we're waiting, for approval of these kinds of entitlements one at a time. It's very powerful. It really is.
And I think the thing to understand here as well is that identity management systems too can open tickets for us automatically. So if we're doing asset provisioning, they need a workstation, we can kick off that request before the person shows up on site. And the day they show up, they have their office space assigned, they have a desktop. This is not systems access or an email account. It's real world physical assets where we kick off that provisioning process through a ticketing system or emails or whatever works within your organization, whatever that process is. So even if it's out of band, we can still kick off those provisioning processes. So when we think about an identity management solution and automation and all the inputs that go into that, and the connectors to the target systems where all the data goes out and all the business events are propagated, if any of these pieces are missing in your IAM solution, it's going to fall short. So modeling of these inputs and outputs is extremely important. So if we think about intelligent automation, we want to help our users be successful. So I had an incident recently where I was told by one of my customers to go out and request access to a system, which required me to request access to a specific group. So I went to their ticketing system to request that access, and I was presented with a pick list of over 1,000 groups that all had very technical names that made no sense to me. Now, I'm in IT. I understand their identity management solution, but their catalog of requests that I could make to get the right group was Byzantine at best. It was impossible for me to know what access I needed. I had to go ask an administrator to help me out to pick the right group so that I could get the right access. That is not business friendly, and it does not drive good results. It's not a good user experience, and we need to help our users through good design with a solution that meets their needs. So starting off with business names, right? Business users should see a business name that makes sense. They don't need to see the technical role or the entitlements behind it, right? There might be 5 groups you get if you request this particular role or this particular level of access. We need to make it easy. With a little bit of thought and a little bit of design, we can take that complexity out of the system, make it much easier for users to request what they need and get it with a lot less pain. We're also able, once we connect our systems, to see patterns across access groups, right? So what does this user's peers have access to, right? This is really the basis for starting to think about roles. How do we define roles? If you're an accountant one, what do we see that all accountant ones in the organization have access to? Is it 3 apps, 4 apps, 5? Great. Once we have that understanding, we can create a base accountant one role. There may be exceptional access that's reasonable, and we can manage that through a request process. But for the first time, we can actually say, this is the standard. This is what all accountant ones get. And once we understand what the standards are, we can build rules and policies and automate, and the system becomes easier and easier to use and delivers more and more value to employees, contractors, and vendors. So the idea here is that we reduce the number of requests required by automating what is common to the job the user is performing. Anything you'd like to add here, Brian?
Yeah, I would just simply say that this is really important. If you if whatever tool you deploy doesn't do everything it can to handhold the requester and to handhold the authorizer, it's really self-defeating. I think about the illustration you just shared with us, right? So if you muddle around in the tool and you can't figure out what it is that you need to request, and that you ultimately have to go ask someone, make a phone call, submit some sort of other ticket, what value is it bringing to the table if that's what you end up doing, right? So it's truly important that whatever tool you deploy facilitates and handholds the people in your organization to getting the access that they need. Really important.
Yeah, you basically need your own geek squad inside the organization to help people get what they want. You're probably not doing it right.
Absolutely.
So that gets us to the notion of standards, which I spoke to briefly there. So, one of the things that occurred to me in looking at the slide as we were having conversations about this, it reminded me actually of the Ford Focus, which may not seem related to identity management at all, but bear with me for a second. So the Ford Focus was actually Ford's first global car platform, and they came up with that concept in 1999 and started building it. And in 2007, Ford had 27 platforms to build vehicles on globally. Today, they have 8 across all their cars and trucks. 8. They went from 27 to 8. And all of their vehicles are built on those 8 platforms, whether it's a compact car, mid-sized car, a truck. And the benefits of that for Ford have actually been huge. It's standardized their manufacturing lines. It's allowed them to share more best practices. They've been way more efficient and driven way more costs out of the manufacturing process than they could have hoped for. It results in increased scalability, consistency of the product. They're much more efficient, and that's only possible where we have standards, right? So if we apply this to identity management, we want to automate things. If everything conforms to a standard, then we can build rules and policies around it and automate. So automation makes this complex system, this system of many, appear fewer. The end user is now oblivious to the complexity behind their requests. They don't see all the bells and whistles and things that have to turn and happen in the background for them to get access. They know they have a very simple process to request access. They get the access they need, and they don't have to sort through a list of 1,000 groups. They don't have to make multiple requests. They don't have to interact with a bunch of technologies. They have a single place to go when they need access, and all they know is when I request access, it gets fulfilled, and I get what I need.
Let me just add a little bit here. I don't know if you don't mind. So just the contrast on this slide here, the parts on the left and the full vehicle, assembled vehicle on the right. Hitachi ID has been operating in this space since the 90s. Has been doing this, and there was a time when we were like the picture on the left, right? We cobbled things together because that's what was required to fit within the processes of the customer. But after a period of time, we start to look back and we say, you know what? A lot of organizations have a whole bunch of commonality. So they hire people, they put them on leave of absence, they unfortunately have to fire people immediately. They perform transfers between departments. There's all these things that are common to an organization. And so what we decided to do was to bake that into our product, right? So out of the box, we'll provide like 24, 25 forms of just these kind of really normal things that businesses do. And then for that other, that gets you 80% of the way. And for that other 20%, well, then you can add that on later, right? And so that's really the approach here. Get you up and running, get you in that car that you can drive off the lot day one.
Thanks, Brian. So ultimately, identity and access management is about delivering value to the business, right? It's not a solution if it doesn't solve a problem, if it doesn't bring value, right? There's opportunities to save costs and improve productivity, clearly improving our security posture, giving us reporting and auditing and centralized management tools is a huge plus. Not to mention better performance and user experience where we're able to automate access requests and provide a better user experience to give them the access they need faster. So as we think about governance versus automation, governance certainly adds value, right? Governance first implementations deliver some value to the business in terms of compliance. It gives us awareness of who has access to what. It gives us the ability to go back and manually remove that access to systems that aren't connected to the identity hub, and we become aware of the issues. But there's very little we can do to remediate those issues without automation. So there's a gap here, right? Governance helps us. It certainly addresses a near-term concern, but if that's all we deliver, then we're leaving a lot of value on the table, right? Unsuccessful identity management implementations have large gaps in the capabilities that they deliver. And quite often organizations are failing to think about the bigger issues and prioritize what they are doing with their programs, which means that the value is slow to materialize. So while governance lets us identify and report on the problems, access problems, in the organization, it does little to help us solve them. So I would argue that automation is the way to lead off in order to integrate with systems, provide a better user experience, and then provide governance as an overlay as part of a comprehensive strategy to deliver as much ROI to the business as possible. What we see too with governance-led initiatives oftentimes is once that governance problem is solved, the business is not willing to invest any additional money in the program because they don't understand the value that it can deliver. So that whack-a-mole strategy where we're solving a tactical problem first and not thinking about all the value we can deliver winds up killing our program ultimately and stopping way short of its full potential. Any thoughts here, Brian?
No, well said, Hanno. These are all of these bullet points are they're really, a collective, picture of everything that makes a good identity and access management solution as compared to governance. Governance is really, it's that snapshot in time. That's the thing that I really want to drive home. If you just do that, the value you get is just, it's not there. It's good for a day, it's good for maybe a week, and it evaporates after that. You really have to have something in process that is ideally self-sustaining and allows the employees, allows the managers, the participants in the so that's part of it, right? You can't fully automate stuff. You have to be able to get human participants into the process. But once you have that all in place, governance then becomes an artifact, right? It's just a, hey, spot check and make sure that automation is doing what it's supposed to. And so that's really what I wanted to if nothing else that comes out of this conversation, that's what I want the folks on the line to walk away with, which is governance is great, but if you have good automation in place, then governance just becomes a spot check on what you already have in place, and then you're freeing up those valuable resources to go and do something better in your organization.
Thanks, Brian. I think those were excellent points, especially around the point in time versus continuous governance. So I'd actually like to ask everyone as sort of a hearts and minds question here. So based on this presentation, which do you think should come first, automation or governance? And see if anyone changed their mind.
And we're about to find out how well we did.
Votes are still coming in.
All right.
Give a couple more seconds here. All right, so we wound up with 82% for automation and 18% for governance. So
very good.
It seems that we made a reasonable case for beginning with automation. So in summary, adopting an automation first mindset is the first step on the path to making digital transformation real in the enterprise, right? It enables the organization to move faster, to be more effective, to serve our workers and customers better. It enables us to work more efficiently. It unburdens us from the mundane, repetitive work of account administration and allows us to focus on more strategic problems and to create value for the business. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. There's a question icon you should be able to click on and type in your questions, and Brian and I are happy to answer them. Usually takes a minute or two for the first question to come in, so we'll just hang in there. Looks like we're not getting any questions this time around, so we must have nailed it.
All right, Willie.
Well, thank you.
I guess that means we did really well.
Exactly. Well, thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate it. We hope you found the session valuable, and we look forward to talking to you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.